The champagne in her glass had gone flat hours ago, but Elena couldn't tear her eyes away from the magazine cover sitting on the marble coffee table, the bold letters of Forbes gleaming under the chandelier's light. It was a face she had erased from her memory 5 years ago, a ghost she thought was buried under debt and disgrace, now staring back at her with a caption that turned her blood to ice. The billionaire who rose from the dead. Her husband, Marcus, was laughing in the other room, unaware that the foundation of their perfect life had just developed a fatal crack. If you want to witness how sweet revenge tastes when it's served cold and dressed in Armani, stay with me. The rain didn't just fall in New York. It tried to drown the city. Julian Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his 45th-floor penthouse, watching the storm batter the glass. Below him, Central Park was a dark, formless void, swallowed by the night. The reflection staring back at him was sharp, tailored, and unrecognizable from the man who had stood on a curb 5 years ago, drenched and broken, watching a taillight fade into the distance. The silence in the apartment was absolute, the kind of quiet that costs $50 million. No leaking faucets, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no desperate shuffling of unpaid bills. Just the hum of the climate control and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the reinforced glass. He turned away from the window and walked to the expansive mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room. Sitting there, in solitary confinement under the beam of a brass lamp, was a single magazine. Forbes. It wasn't due on the newsstands until tomorrow morning. The copy had been messiered over an hour ago by his publicist, accompanied by a bottle of 1945 Romani Conti that remained unopened. Julian didn't touch the magazine immediately. He just looked at it. The cover was minimalist, stark, a black background, and in the center, him. He was wearing a charcoal suit, arms crossed loosely, his expression unreadable, neither smiling nor scowling, just present. The headline, embossed in gold foil, read, "The Architect of Shadows, How Julian Thorne Turned Failure into an Empire. 5 years." It had taken 5 years to claw his way out of the grave. He remembered the taste of the cheap whiskey he'd bought with his last $20 the night Thorne Dynamics filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. He remembered the smell of damp cardboard in the studio apartment he'd rented in Jersey City after the foreclosure. But mostly he remembered the sound of the zipper. Zip. The sound of Elena closing her suitcase. It was a sharp, final sound, like a scalpel severing an artery. "It's not about the money, Julian," she had said, her back turned to him as she checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. She was wearing the cashmere coat he had bought her for their anniversary 3 months prior. "It's about stability. Can't live on maybe anymore. I can't be the wife of a failure. It suffocates me." She hadn't yelled. She hadn't cried. That was the worst part. She had been efficient, pragmatic, as if leaving him was simply a logistical item on her to-do list, right between a Pilates class and a gallery opening. A black sedan had been waiting for her downstairs. Marcus's sedan. Julian reached out and finally touched the glossy cover of the magazine. The paper felt cool under his fingertips. Tomorrow, at approximately 7 a.m., this image would be on every newsstand in Manhattan. It would be on the tablets of every trader on Wall Street. It would be in the break rooms of the law firms that had sued him. And it would be on the breakfast table at the Sterling estate in the Hamptons. He imagined the scene with a clarity that bordered on cinematic. The morning light filtering through the sheer curtains. The smell of freshly ground coffee. Elena, in her silk robe, reaching for the paper or scrolling through her iPad. He wondered if she would scream. Probably not. Elena didn't scream. She gasped. She froze. She calculated. He picked up his phone. No messages. He had changed his number 4 times in 5 years. No one from his old life knew where he was. To them, Julian Thorne was a cautionary tale, a footnote in the history of tech startups that burned too bright and died too young. They had no idea he had spent the last half-decade building Titan Ventures from the ashes, operating in the shadows, funding the very technologies that were now dismantling the old guard. Julian walked back to the window. The rain was letting up, the city lights beginning to pierce through the mist. "Welcome back," he whispered to the empty room. The vibration of the phone in his hand startled him. It was a text from his chief of staff, simple and brief. Distribution confirmed. The embargo lifts at sunrise. Julian deleted the message and poured himself a glass of water. The wine could wait. He needed a clear head. Because tomorrow wasn't just about business. It wasn't just about a comeback. It was about a lesson. He took a sip, the cold liquid grounding him. He wasn't the man who begged Elena to stay. He wasn't the man who had watched the taillights fade. He was the storm that was about to make landfall, and he hoped she had an umbrella. The morning sun over the Hamptons did not warm Elena Sterling. It merely illuminated the flawless, cold precision of her life. She sat on the limestone terrace of their oceanfront estate, wrapped in a robe of Egyptian cotton that cost more than her father's first car. The air smelled of salt spray and expensive landscaping, hydrangeas and boxwoods trimmed to geometric perfection. Before her lay a breakfast she wouldn't eat: sliced grapefruit, poached eggs, and a pot of Earl Grey tea that was slowly losing its heat. Everything was perfect. It was the life she had traded her soul for. Maria left the mail on the side table, Marcus called, out from inside the house. His voice was booming, confident, the voice of a man who assumed the world was listening. He walked onto the terrace a moment later, adjusting the cuffs of his white linen shirt. God, the market is a bloodbath this week. Some shadow fund is buying up tech derivatives like they're candy. Titan Ventures. Ever heard of them? Elena shook her head absently, reaching for the stack of mail. No, Marcus, I haven't. Nobody has. That's the problem. They're aggressive. Dangerous. He picked up a piece of toast, biting into it with a crunch that grated on Elena's nerves. Anyway, I need you to look at the guest list for the Met Gala. We need to make sure we're seated near the senator. Elena didn't answer. Her hand had stopped mid-air. The stack of mail was topped by the latest issue of Forbes. It wasn't the logo that froze the breath in her lungs. It was the eyes. They were steel gray, sharp as cut glass, staring out from the glossy cover with a predatory calmness that made her stomach drop. The face was older, the jawline harder, framed by a beard that was meticulously groomed. It was a face she had kissed 1,000 times, a face she had wiped tears from, a face she had last seen twisted in desperate pleading through a rain-streaked car window. Julian. The world tilted on its axis. The sound of the ocean turned into a roar in her ears, the architect of shadows. How Julian Thorne turned failure into an empire. She felt a physical blow to her chest, a phantom impact that knocked the wind out of her. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she ghosted them over the cover. He looked powerful, not just rich. Wealth was common in her circle. This was different. This was the look of a man who had walked through fire and decided he liked the heat. Elena, did you hear me? Marcus's voice cut through the fog. She snapped her head up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She instinctively slid the magazine under a catalog for Sotheby's, her movements jerky, guilty. The senator, she stammered, her voice sounding thin and foreign. Yes, I'll check the list. Marcus frowned, looking at her over the rim of his coffee cup. You look pale. Is the sea air too much? I have a headache, she lied, the taste of bile rising in her throat. Take something for it. We have the charity auction tonight. I need you glowing. Marcus stood up, checking his watch. He glanced down at the table, his eyes brushing over the pile of mail. Elena held her breath. If he saw it. If he saw him. But Marcus only saw what he wanted to see. He picked up his phone, already dialing his broker. I'm going to the study. If anyone from Titan Ventures calls the office today, tell the secretary to put them through. I want to know who is bleeding my portfolio dry. He walked away, leaving a trail of expensive cologne in the air. Elena waited until the glass door slid shut. Then, with shaking hands, she pulled the magazine back out. She opened it. The article was a 10-page spread. Photos of a penthouse that looked down on the city like Olympus. Mentions of a multi-billion-dollar valuation. Quotes about resilience, vision, and the ruthless efficiency of Titan Ventures. Titan Ventures. The blood drained from her face. The shadow fund Marcus was terrified of. The entity that was destroying his margins. It was Julian. She looked at the photo on page 4. Julian was standing in a boardroom alone, looking out a window. The caption read, I learned that loyalty is an expensive liability. Now I invest only in control. She knew that quote wasn't for the shareholders. It was for her. Elena covered her mouth to stifle a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She looked around her beautiful terrace, at the manicured lawn and the shimmering ocean. Suddenly, the walls of the estate didn't feel like a fortress protecting her from the world. They felt like a cage, and the tiger was loose. She gripped the glossy paper so hard it crinkled. She wanted to scream, to tear the magazine to shreds, to throw it into the ocean, but she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she smoothed out the crease she had made on his suit jacket, her finger lingering on the lapel. A terrifying thought bloomed in the dark corners of her mind, a realization that made her headache split into a blinding migraine. She hadn't just left a husband, she had walked away from a king to marry a court jester, and the king had returned to burn the castle down. The flashbulbs popping outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art didn't look like stars. They looked like explosions. Elena stepped out of the limousine, her hand gripping Marcus's arm so tightly her knuckles were white against the silk of her vintage Dior gown. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the electric hum of New York's elite posturing for relevance. Usually, Elena thrived here. This was her arena. But tonight, she felt like an imposter waiting to be unmasked. Smile, darling. Marcus hissed through his teeth, waving at a photographer from Vanity Fair. And stand up straight. I see the CEO of Morgan Stanley over there. We need to look invincible. Invincible. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. They ascended the iconic steps, a red carpet pilgrimage to the altar of high society. Inside, the great hall was transformed into a cavern of gold leaf and velvet. Waiters drifted through the crowd like ghosts carrying trays of champagne. But the atmosphere was different tonight. There was a weird gravitational pull, a shifting of tides. People weren't looking at the exhibits. They were looking toward the entrance of the Temple of Dender. A hush rippled through the room, starting from the back and rolling forward like a wave. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of predators recognizing a bigger beast. Who is that? Marcus muttered, craning his neck. Elena didn't need to look. Her body knew he was there before her eyes confirmed it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian Thorne walked in. He wasn't alone, but he might as well have been. The supermodel on his arm was stunning, but she was merely an accessory, like his watch or his cufflinks. Julian wore a midnight blue tuxedo that fit him with lethal precision. He moved with a languid, terrifying grace, the crowd parting for him as if he were Moses splitting the Red Sea. He wasn't just attending the gala, he was owning it. "That's him," Marcus whispered, a note of hungry desperation leaking into his voice. "That's Thorne, the Titan Ventures guy. I have to talk to him." "No," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "Marcus, don't." "Don't be ridiculous. This is business." Marcus shook off her hand and adjusted his bow tie, stepping directly into Julian's path. Elena froze. She wanted to dissolve into the floor. She wanted to wake up 5 years ago in their small apartment in Queens, eating takeout on the floor, safe and poor and loved. But she was here, in a $10,000 dress, paralyzed by terror. Julian stopped. The entourage around him halted. He looked at Marcus, his expression devoid of recognition, though Elena knew Julian had a memory like a steel trap. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus said, extending a hand, his smile practiced and oily. "Marcus Sterling, Sterling Industries. We've been feeling your presence in the market lately. I thought it was time we met face to face." Julian didn't take the hand. He let Marcus's hand hang there in the empty air for 3 agonizing seconds, long enough for the people nearby to notice, long enough for the humiliation to set in. "Sterling," Julian said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and dark like unfinished coffee. "I recall the name. You buy distressed assets, strip them, and sell the scraps. Is that correct?" Marcus's smile faltered. Well, it's a bit more complex than—" "I'm sure it is," Julian cut him off. Then, slowly, inevitably, Julian's eyes shifted. He looked past Marcus, locking onto Elena. For a moment, the noise of the gala faded. There was no music, no chatter. Just the gray eyes that used to look at her with adoration, now observing her with the clinical detachment of a scientist looking at a specimen in a jar. He scanned her face, her neck, the diamond necklace Marcus had bought her to apologize for his last affair. Elena stopped breathing. She waited for him to scream, to accuse, to mention the rain or the letter or the divorce. Julian tilted his head slightly, a faint, mocking smile touching the corner of his lips. "And Mrs. Sterling," he said. The name sounded like an insult coming from his mouth. "You look expensive." It wasn't a compliment. It was a price tag. He was acknowledging the transaction she had made with her life. Before she could form a word, before her trembling lips could shape a defense, Julian turned back to the crowd, dismissing them entirely. "Excuse me. I have actual business to attend to." He walked away, leaving them standing in the wake of his cologne, sandalwood and cold rain. Marcus stood there, face red, hand still half raised. "Arrogant prick," he muttered, though his voice shook. "Did you hear that? He barely acknowledged me." Elena stared at Julian's retreating back. She felt cold, colder than she had ever felt in her life. He hadn't fought for her. He hadn't yelled at her. He hadn't even hated her. He had looked at her and seen nothing but a bad investment he had finally written off. And that broke her heart more than any scream ever could. Monday morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the brutal glow of a Bloomberg terminal screen blinking an incessant, angry red. In the cavernous study of the Hamptons estate, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and rising panic. Marcus had not slept. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice climbing an octave with every sentence. "What do you mean hostile? They can't just buy the mezzanine debt without board approval," Marcus shouted, then stopped, listening to the voice of his bewildered general counsel on the other end. His face, usually flushed with the ruddy health of expensive leisure, was now the color of gray putty. "Titan Ventures? Again? God damn it!" He threw the phone onto the leather sofa. It bounced harmlessly, an impotent gesture of rage. Elena stood in the doorway, her hands gripping a ceramic mug of tea she didn't want. She felt like an intruder in her own home. The hostility radiating from Marcus was palpable, a physical weight in the room. "It's him, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Marcus spun around, his eyes wild. "He's not just buying stock, Elena. He's buying the debt. He's buying the bank loans. He's circling the company like a shark smelling blood in the water. By noon, he could trigger a default clause that would strip me of my voting rights." He walked over to her, invading her personal space. For the first time, she smelled liquor on his breath. At 10 in the morning. "You need to call him," Marcus said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Elena took a step back, the ceramic mug trembling in her hands. "Marcus, I can't. You saw him last night. He barely sees me as human." "He was your husband!" Marcus snapped, grabbing her wrist. His grip was too tight, fueled by fear. "He loved you. Men like that, they don't just turn it off. There's still something there. Guilt, nostalgia, lust. I don't care what it is. Use it. Get him a meeting. Buy me time." He released her, turning back to his screens as another alert chimed. "Fix this, Elena. You're the reason he's doing this, so you fix it." Elena fled the room. She walked down the long, silent hallway to the master bedroom, her heart pounding against her ribs. The accusation hung in the air. "You're the reason." She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her phone. Her contact list was full of socialites, gallery owners, and personal shoppers. But the name she needed wasn't there. She had deleted it 5 years ago. With shaking fingers, she searched for Titan Ventures. The number for the headquarters in Manhattan popped up. A general line. She dialed. The ringback tone sounded 3 times, precise and mechanical. "Titan Ventures, Executive Office," a woman's voice answered. Crisp, professional, impenetrable. "Hello?" Elena said, hating the tremor in her voice. "This is Elena Sterling. I'm calling for Julian Thorne." There was a pause. A silence that stretched for 5 seconds, heavy with implication. The assistant didn't ask, "Who?" or, "What is this regarding?" She knew. Julian had likely briefed his gatekeepers. "Mr. Thorne is in a meeting, Mrs. Sterling," the voice replied, devoid of warmth. "It's urgent," Elena pressed, clutching the phone. "Please, just tell him. Tell him it's about the Sterling portfolio. Tell him Elena is asking for 5 minutes." "Mr. Thorne gave me specific instructions regarding inquiries from Sterling Industries," the assistant said. Her tone didn't change, but the words cut like a razor. "He said that all negotiations must go through legal channels. He also mentioned that personal appeals are depreciated assets." Depreciated assets. Elena closed her eyes. It was Julian's language. Cold, financial, dehumanizing. He wasn't just refusing to talk to her. He was letting his secretary deliver the insult. "Please," Elena whispered, her pride dissolving. "Just put me through to his voicemail. I need to speak to him." "I'm afraid that's not possible. Have a good day, Mrs. Sterling." The line clicked dead. Elena lowered the phone. Outside the window, the ocean churned, gray and restless. Down the hall, she could hear Marcus shouting again, the sound of a man watching his kingdom crumble brick by brick. She realized then that Julian wasn't coming for the money. He had enough money. He was coming for the suffocating sense of helplessness he had felt 5 years ago. He was bottling it, packaging it, and force-feeding it back to them, spoon by spoon. She looked at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the wife of a tycoon anymore. She was a hostage. The elevator ride to the 62nd floor of the Titan Ventures tower took less than a minute, but to Elena, it felt like a descent into the underworld. When the doors slid open, she wasn't greeted by brimstone, but by an expanse of white marble and glass so pristine it made her eyes ache. The receptionist, the same woman with the ice water voice from the phone, didn't even ask for her name. She simply gestured toward the double doors at the end of the hall. "He has 10 minutes, Mrs. Sterling." Elena walked down the corridor, the sound of her heels swallowed by the thick carpet. She entered the office. It was a cavernous space dominating the skyline, with Manhattan spread out below like a circuit board. Julian was standing behind his desk, reading a file. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't offer her a seat. "You used your father's connection to the board to force this meeting," Julian said, turning a page. His voice was conversational, devoid of warmth. "Resourceful. I always admired that about you." "I didn't come here to play games, Julian," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. She clutched her purse like a shield. "I came to ask you to stop. You're destroying Marcus. You're destroying us." Julian finally looked up. He took off his reading glasses and placed them on the desk with a deliberate click. "I am not destroying anyone, Elena. I am acquiring a failing company. That is capitalism. Marcus is simply collateral damage." "He's my husband," she pleaded, stepping closer. And despite everything, I know you're not a cruel man. I know the man I married." Julian laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. He walked around the desk and leaned against the edge, crossing his arms. "The man you married died 5 years ago. He died in a studio apartment in Jersey City while trying to figure out how to pay for heat." Elena flinched. The memory was a physical blow. "I didn't leave because of the money, Julian. You have to believe me. I left because we were drowning. I was scared. I thought if I left, you would have one less burden. I did it for you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian stared at her, his eyes drilling into hers. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "Is that the story you tell yourself to sleep at night?" he asked softly. He pushed off the desk and walked toward the window, looking out at the city he now owned a piece of. "Let me tell you what actually happened, Elena. You didn't leave because we were drowning. You left because you looked at me, and you looked at the statistics, and you decided I was a bad bet." "That's not true." "It is," he cut her off, his voice sharpening like a blade. "You are a pragmatist, Elena. You always were. You saw a sinking ship, and you saw Marcus Sterling cruising by in a yacht. You didn't jump to save me. You jumped to save yourself. Don't insult my intelligence by dressing up your survival instinct as martyrdom." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Hot, angry tears. "I was 28. I wanted a life, Julian. Is that a crime? To want security?" "No," Julian turned back to her. "It's not a crime. It's a choice, and you made yours." He checked his watch, a gesture of dismissal that stung more than a slap. "Marcus is incompetent. His company is over-leveraged and mismanaged. I'm going to strip it down, sell the parts, and rebuild it properly. It's business, just like your marriage to him was business. Elena stared at him. The handsome, broken boy she had loved was gone. In his place was a titan of industry, hard and impenetrable as the steel beams holding up the building. "You hate me," she whispered. "No," Julian said, walking back to his chair. "I don't hate you. Hate implies passion. I simply understand you now. You are just another variable I can predict." He sat down and opened the file again. "Your 10 minutes are up, Mrs. Sterling. Please close the door on your way out." Elena stood there for a heartbeat, her entire body vibrating with a mix of shame and rage. She wanted to scream at him, to scratch that calm veneer off his face. But she knew it was useless. He was behind the glass now, and she was on the outside, looking in. She turned and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. The digital forensic audit of Sterling Industries was supposed to be a routine autopsy. Julian expected to find embezzlement, tax evasion, or perhaps inflated assets, the standard sins of a desperate CEO. He did not expect to find a murder weapon. It was 2:00 a.m. on Wednesday. The city outside was asleep, but the war room at Titan Ventures was humming with the quiet intensity of a bomb disposal unit. Julian sat at the head of the conference table, his tie loosened, watching the data streams on the main projection wall. "Julian, look at this," said Kenji, his lead forensic analyst. Kenji didn't use drama. If he spoke up, it was lethal. Julian slid his chair over. On Kenji's screen was a recovered folder from Sterling's private server, flagged during the hostile acquisition of the debt tranches. The folder was dated 5 years ago, the month Thorne Dynamics had collapsed. "It wasn't a bug in the code," Kenji said, his voice low. "Look at the payment ledger. Sterling Industries wired $200,000 to an offshore account in the Caymans 3 days before your system crashed." Julian squinted at the beneficiary name. It was a shell company, but the signatory was listed in the metadata. David Aris. Julian felt the blood turn cold in his veins. David Aris had been his lead engineer, the man who had shrugged helplessly when the servers melted down, claiming it was a fatal architecture error. The man who had wept at the closing party. Marcus paid him to sabotage the launch, Julian whispered. The realization didn't make him angry. It made him unnervingly calm. The failure that had haunted him, the incompetence he had internalized for half a decade, it was a lie. He hadn't failed. He had been assassinated. "There's more," Kenji said, hesitating for the first time. "We found a correspondence thread attached to the payout authorization. It seems Marcus wanted to ensure his investment was secure." He clicked a file. An email chain opened. From Marcus Sterling to Elena Vance, personal. Date, October 14th, 2019, 2 days before Elena left. Subject, the path forward. Julian read the words, and the room seemed to tilt. "Elena, the crash is inevitable. I've ensured the IP will be worthless by Monday. Don't go down with the ship. If you leave now, I can protect you. If you stay, you're tied to a fraud investigation. Make the choice. I'm waiting." And below it, a reply sent 4 hours later. From Elena Vance to Marcus Sterling. "The path forward. I'm packing. Just promise me he won't go to jail. I can't handle that guilt. Pick me up on Friday." Julian sat back in his chair. The silence in the room was deafening. The hum of the servers, the distant wail of a siren, it all faded into a white noise. She knew. For 5 years, he had believed she was just weak. He had believed she was a fair-weather wife who couldn't handle poverty. He had made peace with her pragmatism. But this was not pragmatism. This was complicity. She hadn't just left him because he failed. She had known Marcus was the one holding the knife, and she had stepped into the getaway car. She had traded his life's work for a guarantee that she wouldn't be inconvenienced by the fallout. "Sir?" Kenji asked softly. "Do we release this to the SEC?" Julian stared at the screen, at the name of the woman he had once vowed to protect with his life. The last shred of empathy he held for her evaporated, replaced by a cold, dark resolve. "No," Julian said. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "The SEC deals with fines. This is personal." He walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling darkness of New York. The rain had started again, mirroring that night 5 years ago. But this time, he wasn't the victim standing in the downpour. "Get the car ready," Julian commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And send a copy of that email to my personal phone. I'm going to pay the Sterlings a visit." He wasn't going to take their company anymore. That was too small a punishment. He was going to take their lie. The Sterling estate was no longer a home. It was a sinking ship, and the rats were screaming. Marcus had been drinking since noon. The bottle of scotch on the coffee table was empty, and his eyes were rimmed with red, manic exhaustion. The house was strangely quiet. The staff had been dismissed, or perhaps they had simply fled before the paychecks bounced. "You have to go to him, Elena," Marcus slurred, pacing the living room with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. "The lawyers say he's invoking the penalty clauses. They're going to seize the house, the cars, everything." Elena sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at her hands. She felt numb, a kind of paralysis that comes after too much pain. "I already went to him, Marcus. He doesn't care." "You didn't try hard enough?" Marcus roared, throwing a crystal tumbler against the wall. It shattered, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor like diamonds. "He was obsessed with you. Men don't just forget that. Go to his apartment. Tonight. Wear that black dress he liked. Cry, beg. Use your body if you have to. I don't care what you do, just fix this." Elena looked up at her husband. For the first time in 5 years, she saw him clearly. There was no charm left, no power. Just a pathetic, hollow man who would sell his wife to save his net worth. Something inside her, a tether that had been fraying for years, finally snapped. "No," she said softly. "What did you say?" Marcus snarled, stepping toward her. "I said no." Elena stood up. She wasn't trembling anymore. The fear had evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy resolve. "I'm going to see him, but not for you, and not to save this house." She walked past him, grabbing her keys. Marcus shouted something after her, a threat, a plea, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. She walked out the door and didn't look back. The drive into the city was a blur of highway lights and rain. Elena rehearsed the words in her head 1,000 times. She was going to tell Julian everything. She would confess that she knew about the sabotage. She would tell him about the email Marcus had sent her, the one she had never deleted from her conscience. She would hand him the knife to cut her own throat, hoping that the truth, however ugly, would finally end this war. She arrived at Julian's building just after midnight. The doorman let her in without a word, as if he had been expecting her. The penthouse was dark, lit only by the glow of the city grid outside. Julian was sitting on the leather sofa, a glass of water in his hand, staring at the television screen which was turned off. "I didn't think you'd come," Julian said. He didn't stand up. Marcus sent me, Elena said, her voice echoing in the large room. She remained standing near the entrance, unable to cross the threshold into his space. He wanted me to beg. And are you begging? No. Elena took a deep breath. I'm here to tell you the truth. The real reason I left. Julian turned his head slowly to look at her. His face was in shadow, unreadable. Go on. I knew, she whispered. The words tore out of her throat, painful and jagged. 5 years ago, before the crash, Marcus told me he had paid someone to ruin your code. He told me that if I stayed, I'd be dragged down into the investigation. He offered me a way out. She started to cry, silent tears that tracked hot paths down her cheeks. I didn't leave because you were poor, Julian. I left because I was a coward. I let him destroy you because I was too afraid to fall with you. I've lived with that every single day. She waited for the explosion. She waited for him to yell, to throw her out, to look at her with the hatred she deserved. Instead, Julian reached toward the coffee table. He picked up a single piece of paper and slid it across the polished surface. Come here, Elena, he said quietly. She walked forward, her legs feeling like lead. She looked down at the paper. It was a printout of an email. Her email. I'm packing. Just promise me he won't go to jail. I can't handle that guilt. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The room spun. You knew, she stammered. I found it 4 hours ago, Julian said. His voice was tired, devoid of triumph. I was waiting to see if you would come here to lie again, or if there was anything left of the woman I once loved. He stood up and walked over to her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, but he felt miles away. You came to confess to save your conscience, Julian said, looking down at her. But you can't save what you sold 5 years ago. I wanted to fix it, she sobbed, sinking to her knees. I wanted to stop this. It is stopped, Julian replied, looking over her head at the skyline. I don't need to destroy Marcus anymore. You just did it for me. By coming here, by admitting this, you've confirmed everything I needed to know. He looked down at her one last time. There was no love in his eyes, but the hate was gone too. There was only a profound, empty pity. Go home, Elena. There's nothing for you here. The signing took place in the same conference room where Marcus Sterling had once boasted about crushing his competition. Now, the room smelled of lemon polish and defeat. Marcus sat hunched over the mahogany table, a pen hovering over the documents that would transfer 90% of Sterling Industries to Titan Ventures. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. His hands shook as he signed his name. Once, twice, 10 times. With each scrawl of ink, a piece of his identity was stripped away. Julian stood by the window, watching the city traffic far below. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He felt a strange, quiet lightness in his chest, like a fever finally breaking after a long illness. It's done, Marcus rasped, sliding the papers across the table. You have the company. You have the patents. Are you going to take the house too? Throw us on the street? Julian turned around. He looked at Marcus, then at Elena, who was sitting in the corner chair. She was dressed in gray, blending into the shadows. She hadn't spoken a word since she arrived. Her eyes were red-rimmed, fixed on the floor. No, Julian said calmly. Keep the house, Marcus. Keep the cars. I have no interest in your personal assets. Elena looked up, surprise flickering in her dull eyes. Why? She whispered. Julian buttoned his jacket, checking his reflection in the glass one last time. Not to admire himself, but to make sure the ghost of the man he used to be was truly gone. Because if I take everything, you become victims, Julian said, walking toward the door. And I don't want you to be victims. I want you to be exactly what you are. Two people who have everything they thought they wanted, and nothing else. He paused at the door, his hand on the brass handle. You have your stability, Elena. You have your husband. I hope it's enough. He walked out. The lobby of the building was chaotic. Reporters had gathered, sensing the shift in power. Cameras flashed as Julian emerged onto the street, but he didn't stop to give quotes. He moved through the crowds with the momentum of a man who had a plane to catch. His black SUV was waiting at the curb. As he reached for the door handle, he felt a presence behind him. He turned. Elena had followed him out. She stood on the sidewalk, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. She looked small against the backdrop of the towering skyscrapers. People pushed past her, oblivious to the woman who had once thought she was the center of the world. "Julian," she called out. The name sounded fragile in the noise of the city. He looked at her, really looked at her. For 5 years, she had been the monster under his bed, the reason for his nightmares, the fuel for his ambition. He expected to feel anger or triumph, or perhaps a lingering ache of love, but he felt nothing. She was just a stranger in a gray coat, a bad memory that had lost its sharp edges. He didn't say goodbye. There was no need. He simply nodded, a final, silent acknowledgement of their shared history, and got into the car. "Teterboro Airport," Julian told the driver as the door clicked shut, sealing out the noise of New York. "Yes, sir." And then? "London," Julian said, leaning his head back against the leather seat. "I have a new project starting Monday." As the car pulled away, merging into the stream of yellow taxis and buses, Julian didn't look back through the rear window. He pulled out his phone and deleted the folder labeled Sterling. It was gone. On the sidewalk, Elena watched the taillights disappear into the canyon of steel and glass. The sun was breaking through the clouds, bathing the street in a harsh, revealing light. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, shivering despite the warmth. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Marcus. "Where are you? Come back inside. We need to figure out how to spin this to the press." Elena looked at the message. Then she looked at the empty spot where Julian's car had been. She realized then that Julian's revenge wasn't that he had destroyed her life. It was that he had outgrown it. He was flying toward a future she couldn't even imagine, while she was left here, anchored to a sinking stone she had chosen with her own hands. She put the phone back in her pocket and turned around to go back to her husband. It was a long walk back to the lobby, and for the first time in her life, she knew she would be walking it alone.